Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Strobe Talbot from next door at the Brookings Institution. This is obviously a very civic-minded group that would come in from this wonderful weather we have out here. And if it weren't such a beautiful venue here in this building, I would suggest that we all just move out to DuPont Circle and have a circle and have a conversation there. Anyway, on behalf of my colleagues from Brookings, let me just say that good neighbors make good events. It's hard to imagine a better threesome to help us understand and navigate the extraordinary passage that we're experiencing in our politics, our society, and our role in the world. Tom, Norm, and EJ have been individually and together collaborating as colleagues for a very long time. Now they are authors of a powerful book that helps us figure out what happened and why, what does it mean now, what does it mean next, and what are the remedies for bringing more health to American democracy. So thanks to them for helping us as citizens, and thanks to Carlin for moderating the panel.
Thank you very much, Strobe.
Over there?
You don't even get a chair.
No.
I'm going to do this again.
Watch that.
Watch that. It's a little tricky.
Thanks.
No, there's a throne for Strobe over there, I hope.
Thank you, Strobe. Good afternoon. And let me welcome all of you to today's event to celebrate the publication of EJ, Norm's, and Tom's new book, One Nation After Trump. I have known this trio for nearly 40 years, from our first interactions at AI in the late 1970s. I've watched them make important contributions to our understanding of Congress, the parties, and elections. They are well known, but let me introduce them to you very briefly. E.J. Dionne is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a columnist for the Washington Post, and a professor at Georgetown, and soon to be a professor at Harvard. He is the author of many books, including Why Americans Hate Politics, and most recently, Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism from Goldwater to Trump and Beyond. Tom Mann is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings and resident scholar at the Institute of Governmental Studies at Berkeley. Tom held the Averill Harriman Chair at Brookings that EJ now holds. My colleague Norm Ornstein is a resident scholar here at AEI. He was the co-director of the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project and senior counselor to the Continuity of Government Commission. Norm and Tom's book, Vital Statistics on Congress, whose first edition came out in 1980, is an essential reference work for anyone who follows Congress. Their most recent book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism, was a New York Times bestseller. They are all prolific, and they have never been shy about their beliefs, nor about their concern for good governance. We frequently disagree about politics, but in a town that's riven by deep partisan divisions, I count them all as friends. Many years ago, I spoke with one of the all-time great speechwriters in Washington, and I asked him for advice about how to review books. He said there are 3 simple rules. Tell the audience what the book says, how well it says it, and then why it's important if it is. I think that's an excellent way to organize today's discussion, and I will begin by posing a question to introduce you and all of our live stream audience to each of the book's 3 major sections. Then one of the authors will respond for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then all of us will discuss that section. The first part of the book might be titled, How We Got Here. The second focuses on the dangers the authors see to the rule of law and long-standing political norms from the Trump presidency. The third section describes where they want the country to go from here. We're going to devote 20 minutes to each section, and then we're going to turn to your questions. One quick housekeeping announcement. The authors have agreed to sign books after this session. We're going to have you line up in a middle aisle right here, and the books are for sale right outside. Let's begin. And EJ, I'm going to start with you. You begin the book by saying, and I'm quoting here, "We have never had a president who, from his first days in office, plainly showed that he had no business being president." Yet Trump cleared the field of an impressive array of Republican challengers, and last November, almost 63 million people voted for him. Most of his supporters still support him. In every recent poll, around 80% of Republicans say that they support Donald Trump. How do you explain Trump's rise, and what have Republicans and Democrats gotten wrong about the meaning of Trump's election?
Thank you so much. Because I'm the first one speaking, I just want to first acknowledge two people in the audience. You'll see this in our acknowledgments, without whom this book could not have happened. One is Tim Bartlett, our editor at St. Martin's Press, who's been absolutely amazing. 3 guys on 2 coasts producing a book this quickly, and St. Martin's, as you can see, just did a spectacular job for us. Bless you, Tim. The other is my assistant, Adam Waters. Where are you, Adam? There you are, without whom we couldn't have written the book. There were so many times when I gave a piece of manuscript to Adam and said, "What do we do with this?" And Adam always knew what to do with this. And so God bless you, Adam, and thank you. And his thoughts are very important here. A couple other things I want to say. First, I love Carlin Bowman, and anybody who knows her loves Carlin. And I have been a token liberal at AEI now for 39 years, periodically. And my very first connection with AEI came with an excellent magazine, which, by the way, AEI, you should restart, called Public Opinion. And Carlin was the managing editor. Is that the right title? And
right.
She was one of the first editors of my life, and it's been very hard to find one who matches. Tim's done a good job, but bless you, Carlin. And then I want to salute AEI for 2 things. First, Tom and I have been trying to steal Norm to Brookings for years, and AEI has been smart enough not to let him go. And the second thing is I want to praise AEI for its exceptionally social democratic policy of giving all its employees free lunch at the cafeteria. There is such a thing as a free lunch, and it is at AEI, and may this excellent policy begin to influence some of its economic analysis. So thank you. It's great to be here. The beginning of the book is about why Trump happened. And there are several pieces of our argument, and I'll just run through them quickly, and Tom and Norm will have a lot to say about that as well. The first goes back to our earlier books, which is has been a radicalization in the Republican Party that permitted Donald Trump to win this nomination. One of my favorite lines is from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, where he said, "Those who foolishly ride to power on the back of the tiger end up inside." And that is essentially what happened to the Republican establishment, that the Republican establishment courted a lot of these feelings of an anti-government attitude, an increasingly hard line on immigration, quite different from Ronald Reagan's or George H.W. Bush's or George W. Bush's. They played at the edges of racial politics, as many have said. The dog whistle has become the bullhorn. And they welcomed Donald Trump's interventions in politics. When he began his birther campaign, there were some Republicans who said, "Oh no, President Obama was born in the United States." But quickly, John Boehner on one occasion said, but he wouldn't denounce this view. He said people are free to believe what they want. And I think that sent a signal to the Republican Party. So there was a radicalization both of the leadership and then increasingly in the membership of the Republican Party as the primary electorate moved steadily to the right over the last 30 years. That allowed Donald Trump to win the Republican nomination, and that was singularly important. Donald Trump would not have been elected as an independent. The first and most important piece of Donald Trump's vote was Republican. He won about 88% of self-described Republicans. It is said that white working class voters elected Donald Trump. Well, 59% of college-educated white men voted for Donald Trump. And they were voting in the hope of tax cuts, which we'll hear about soon, the deregulatory policies that Trump has pursued, and of course, intense hostility to Hillary Clinton. The third piece that I'll just talk about briefly is we devoted a whole chapter to the question of whether Trump was elected because of attitudes on race, immigration, and culture, or whether it was economics that was at the heart of Trump's election. And there's actually been quite a lot of good work done by academics and others since the election, and we cite a lot of these studies in the book. On the one hand, it is undeniable that attitudes toward race and immigration played a central role in Trump's election. After party voting, all of these surveys based on public opinion suggest a very strong kind of backlash component to the Trump vote. And by the way, a lot of people said, well, if people switch from Obama to Trump, they couldn't possibly be motivated by race. Actually, there were studies that show that many of those switchers did have attitudes on race that were more conservative, more sensitive. I'm not going to use the word racist here, but there was clearly a racial factor. And I think it's worth remembering that Mitt Romney and John McCain did not play on the race issue in their campaigns. Donald Trump did, and it appears to have had an effect. So there's some who want to say it was all race and culture, and that's the end of the story. But it's not the end of the story, because if you take the studies based on public opinion, it tilts in that direction. But if you look at the studies based on geography, where did the Trump votes come from? What you see is Trump by far did best in the parts of the country where levels of economic anxiety were very high. Places, not necessarily the highest unemployment, but places with high levels of foreclosures, for example, after the Great Recession began. Places where there were a large number of jobs that were subject either to outsourcing abroad or to technological change. Clearly, there was a factor of economic security. Norm, can you pass me the book? I just want to reclose with two quotations from Trump supporters. Thank you. And that we argue so that economics clearly played a role and that the cultural backlash took place within an economic context. And so we argue very strongly that people on all sides should resist two forms of denial. Denial number one is to deny that there was a strong racial element to the Trump campaign, that there were voters casting ballots on the basis of racial issues or immigration or culture. But denial number two would be to say that, to say that the economy had nothing to do with this. As we'll get to later, we believe that the deep inequalities in the country, not only among individuals, but also among regions, as well as across races, these inequalities played havoc with our country and helped allow Donald Trump to become president. I just want to quote two Trump voters to show how complicated figuring out this question really is and how there's a kind of overlap here. There was a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who had the money to support himself to spend months traveling the country interviewing Trump supporters. And there were two Trump supporters we quoted whom I think are quite revealing. One of them said, and remember he's from Silicon Valley, one of them said, "I'm so tired of hearing about white privilege. I'm white, but way less privileged than a black person from your world. I have no hope my life will ever get any better." And another said, "I'd love to see 1/10 of the outrage about the state of our lives out here that you have for Muslims from another country. You have no idea what our lives are like." And I think in those two quotations, you see the interaction of a certain kind of reaction on race, culture, religion, but also a strong class conscious component. And I think those two Trump voters tell us a lot about why Donald Trump won. And my colleagues will go on, I am sure, to explain why we also lay heavy emphasis in the book on how the United States is becoming a non-majoritarian democracy. There is that small problem with the popular vote, and I know my colleagues would love to talk about that.
Norm, what would you add to what EJ said?
Just a couple of things to add on. we really look more broadly and back a longer ways at some of the roots here. And a good part of it is the decline in community, the sense of atomization out in the country, the challenges to civil society. And so we not only point back to Bob Putnam and Bowling Alone, and Bill Bishop and what he's written, but also, for example, to Bob Nisbet, a great sociologist who was here with us, who was pointing out 50 years ago or more about some of these problems in community. Kai Erickson, who wrote about a community in West Virginia that had very strong bonds and then a flood, this took it apart. So it's economic dislocation, it's race, but it's also this sense that the bonds that we have as a society were coming apart a little bit. And just to make one other point, we are very tough on Republicans, but we want and understand that this political system, this Republican form of democracy, will not work unless we have two vibrant, problem-solving oriented parties. And one of the reasons I'm very proud to be here at AEI is that so many of our scholars, some of whom we cite in the book, have focused on ideas and at solving problems. And the frustration that many of us have, and I'm not alone here, is that the political figures who've helped to create this tiger that they are now residing inside have had no interest in most of, or in many of those ideas.
Tom.
First, let me say I'm delighted to be back at AEI. I actually worked for AEI for a couple of years. Norman and I came together to start a Congress project, which led to vital statistics on Congress and to a series of dinners with the members of the class of 1978, which included Dick Cheney and Newt Gingrich. And it was there that we discovered what Newt had in mind. Yes, Jerry Ferraro and others. I want to go back to the first sentence that Carlin read in the book. American democracy was never supposed to give the nation a president like Donald Trump. The founders worried a lot about demagogues back in their days. They gave careful thought to not having our new democracy fall prey to autocrats, to authoritarians, to mob rule, whatever you have. But they tried to design a system that would produce a person who would lead the country reflecting small r Republican virtue. When we think of our Constitution, we usually think of channeling ambitions and checks and balances and institutions, and all of that is true. But the founders really believed that it was then just men of goodwill. Fortunately, we can change that now. There were a lot of flaws in our initial document, but would pick through this weird device called an electoral college someone like them, and therefore we could count on a George Washington to begin with and others following in line with that. And it turns out that system of selecting presidents eventually provided for popular votes that wasn't really active until Andrew Jackson. But it's always in the full 19th and 20th century dependent upon political parties to find a candidate to slate for office of President of the United States that, if elected, would serve honorably and effectively and reflect those virtues. So the first big mystery about this election is, why didn't it work? The whole system of the party decides, the invisible primary. Somehow Donald Trump slipped through the nets. And what we are discovering is that the second line of defense against a demagogue were the set of institutions. And now, with the way in which the party system has developed, it isn't sufficient. We have some institutions that are doing quite well, but others are floundering. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, which EJ alluded to, is that oddly, because of peculiar features of our institutional democracy, as well as the changing shape of the political parties, we have minority rule in this country now. It's really an anti-majoritarian system that results partly from the geographical distribution of partisans, where Democrats and where Republicans congregate, and what the impact of that is on the Senate, and with partisan gerrymandering on the House, and in addition, of course, to the Electoral College. We now have had 2 out of the last 5 elections in which the winner of the popular vote, this time by 2.9 million votes, lost the electoral vote by a total of 77,000 votes in 3 states. And if you look at the projections over time, you will find that 30% of the population will control 70 senators. We're only a couple of decades away. If our parties stay as much at war with one another, the tribalism continues. Will our democracy prevail with 30% in a position to dominate the governing institutions of our democracy?
Could I just add one quick thing on
Sure.
that, just to underscore what Tom said, just to sort of think about this? As Tom said, by 2050, 70% of us will live in 15 states. So that's one problem. But that refracts back to the Electoral College. There's a reason why we've had 2 out of the last 5 elections be out of line, whereas from the time the popular vote became the rule in 1824 all the way through 1996. In all those elections, there were only 3, and 2 of them were really peculiar. 1824, where there were 4 candidates, and 1876, where there was so much corruption, nobody really knows what the popular vote was. And so you had that one Grover Cleveland election. There's a reason for that, which is that the country is becoming more and more metropolitan. And our systems, the Senate in particular, which heavily influences the Electoral College, are geared very much towards smaller and predominantly rural states. So you have this disconnect that is growing. And just for those who would suggest, well, we shouldn't mess with the organization created by the founders wouldn't recognize the Electoral College system as it exists, because the founders never even conceived of the popular vote picking electors. So we're not really where the founders are, but we are in this netherworld. And then 2 other factors. One is gerrymandering. Good study by the Brennan Center, which shows that somewhere about 16 seats are Republican that wouldn't be without the gerrymander, which means about 2/3 of their majority right now is from gerrymandering. Yes, Democrats are more concentrated in urban areas, but gerrymandering, which happens to be more Republican than usual because the Republicans did so well in the 2010 elections, is really distorting the system. And then lastly, recently, is what I would call voter suppression, what we would call voter suppression, which is moves to make it harder for people to vote. And all these things, I think, are creating a small d democratic crisis that I think we're going to have to address sooner rather than later.
Thanks, EJ. I think that was a wonderful introduction to the book. Let me just pose a few quick questions. You were all students of parties, and one thing that I was surprised not to see in the book as an explanation for the vote for Trump was simply a binary choice. Republicans voted for Republicans, Democrats voted for Democrats. You didn't mention that.
You know, one of the things we did talk about that I think is related to this is the degree to which polarization has become tribal in nature. When Tom and I wrote our last book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, and then its update, It's Even Worse Than It Was.
And then the sequel to that, Run for the Hills.
Yeah. We almost titled the third one, Run for Your Lives. But polarization is one thing. You can have very different political views and yet still find common ground or trade-offs to make things work. Tribalism, where you view the other side as the enemy, that started in Washington and metastasized out to many states and now to the public as a whole. And we know now that people vote more based on their antipathy towards the other side than they do towards an attachment to their own. And that means that any kind of candidate you nominate is going to start now with probably 45 to 48% of the votes. And unfortunately, what that also means is that there are fewer checks in a party system in nominating somebody who's way outside the arena. You're still within striking distance of the presidency. And another part of this is, I think, the signals that many elites sent, including those in Congress. You know, we had Jason Chaffetz, after the Access Hollywood tape, say famously, "How can I look my 15-year-old daughter in the eye after this?" And then about 10 days later said, well, of course I'm going to vote for him because the alternative is so much worse. I don't know if he's able to look his 15-year-old daughter in the eye now, but when you get a signal like that, and a similar one from Speaker Paul Ryan, that it's okay, that also takes you in a direction where it makes it easier for somebody to win, even if under most circumstances you'd look and say, how can this person be elected president?
We need to move on, but I want to ask one more question of VJ. I think we all agree that it's hard to isolate a single factor as an explanation for any election outcome overall. But you
Comey. No, excuse me.
but you clearly tilt to the race and cultural explanation overall. And I'm curious whether you've looked at Emily Ekins of Cato's work. Emily was a research assistant of ours here at AI, and she's done a typology of Trump voters in which she argues that a very small proportion, 20% of those people who voted for Trump actually had more conservative views on immigration and more nativist views overall, and that there were a lot of parts of the Trump coalition that looked like free enterprisers or staunch Republicans, but just plain old Republicans.
I not only looked at her work, but I admired it so much that I wrote a column about it.
Oh, well, that's good. I missed
so
that.
There is a column out there. The way I read her, correct me if I'm wrong, and by the way, I was staring through the book. I thought for sure we have party in there somewhere,
You
that we
do.
point out that Trump won the Republican vote. You know,
You do
Adam,
that,
did we
yeah.
cut it out? I hope not.
No, you
Taken out and
But
shot.
we might have actually emphasized it properly more than we did, but it's in there somewhere. The way I read her analysis is about 40 to 50% of Trump's vote is basically traditional Republican voting, but there were several other groups that included some more pure backlash voters, which is about 20%. I'm putting words in her mouth, but we're describing it that way. But there was another group of kind of working class voters whom I think who were affected by, some of it was sort of backlash in cultures, but some of it was economic. So I think the group is a little bigger in her surveys, but that is, for those of you who haven't seen it, it is one of the most interesting analyses of the Trump vote I have seen, and the only reason that it's not in our book is because we ran across it after the book was finished. But I highly recommend that, and I would add that to a second edition of the book.
Very good. We're going to now move on to Tom. And as you can tell, this book is seamlessly written. Your editors did an absolutely superb job. It's hard to tell where Norm begins and EJ starts. It's very, very good in that regard. Tom, the book focuses largely on what you see as the dangers of Trump's presidency, the dangers he poses to the rule of law and to the all-important political norms. But many who've been critical of Donald Trump's action on both of these fronts have also noted that the system of checks and balances has worked very well thus far. The courts have blocked his actions. His attorney general recused himself from the Russia investigation, and he's held firm. Many of his appointments are highly regarded. Congress has not been a rubber stamp. Conservatives at publications like National Review and the Weekly Standard have been fierce critics. The system seems to be working. As Harvard professor Jack Goldsmith said last week in The Atlantic, Trump has invigorated constitutional checks and balances and the nation's appreciation for them. Presidential violations of norms aren't new, and isn't it quite possible that the next Republican or any of those other Republicans on the stage would have restored them, or would have kept with the other?
That's a very hopeful view of
Yeah.
American democracy, and in fact, we agree with a good part of it. We too write about the reaction of the courts, of the mobilization of lawyers. We talk about the importance of public bureaucracies that have public civil servants, good people that reflects better than the deep state, I think it's fair to say. But yes, there has been a reaction, and some of the checks that we had hoped for have come forward front and center. But norms, it turns out, are as important or more important than institutions. And what Donald Trump has done is build on the decline of norms in American politics and in American political institutions like the Congress for decades in a way that is shocking and disturbing. And I think many of us are upset every day or every several days with the demonization of someone. The election is long gone, but we still have to learn about crooked Hillary and chants of lock her up and hear individual members of government and society demonized because they dared challenge the words of President Trump. It's been a very unnerving time. The media is the enemy of the people, a line that Khrushchev banned from popular use because it was so dangerous and threatening. I think we've seen Mr. Trump more comfortable with autocrats around the world than Democrats. I think he has seemed closer to the kleptocratic behavior of autocrats than any president we've seen by a long measure. Trump Incorporated is not much different than the Trump government being led by this man, and the ethical violations by Trump, members of his family, his cabinet, are very unnerving. Now, does that mean the end of democracy as we know it? Of course not. There's another story as well, which has been an extraordinary resistance built up in this country over this period of time, and so the reasons to be comfortable. But I am, for example, very discouraged by the response of Republicans to fail to challenge the president on his language, on his behavior, on his recklessness in firing Jim Comey, among other things. So it's a case where the strong partisan loyalty overtakes the institutional checks and balances that the founders certainly had in mind, and that's a very worrisome development in our country. So I think a lot of people in this country are embarrassed, and a lot of people around the world are absolutely bewildered by what has happened to the leader of the democratic world and of global security. It's intellectual conservatives have led the charge in many respects, but they don't have many allies in government. They're fearful, and now we're seeing the destruction of norms on the health care that goes even beyond the failure to give Merrick Garland a hearing and a vote on his appointment to the Supreme Court. It is stunning what Mitch McConnell said to AEI after he became majority leader about how norms were violated while Democrats were in charge and Obama was such a partisan president, and then said he was going to run the Senate in a very different way. That different way on health care is there for all to see. We had well over 100 days of hearings on the Affordable Care Act, and we've had none on the, today the Homeland Security Committee is having 2 people testify. I believe it's Senator Graham and Senator Cassidy. So it's so we have problems.
We use 3 words in the book, the last one of which I drag my colleagues kicking and screaming to using. One is autocracy, the second is kleptocracy, and the third is kakistocracy. The third is
it was so educational to write this book.
Yes,
I had never heard that word before.
It was even a new word to Deborah Tannen.
Yes.
Yesterday.
It comes from the Greek, and Deborah actually speaks fluent Greek, having spent many years living there. And the root of the word is the worst kind of thing. It's the worst kind of government. And the root, actually, if you've heard the word kaka, it also applies. But if we look at each of these,
that's very Ornsteinian.
Yes,
if you don't know.
It's scholarly. Bill Sapphire would appreciate it if he were here with us. We've talked some about the autocracy and a tiny bit about the kleptocracy. But what you hope for, and what Alexander Hamilton wrote about back in the day when he was concerned about Aaron Burr being a kind of president who had no values and was out for power, was that an independent Congress would be a check and balance. So if you look at the violations of the emoluments clauses, the behavior of the family, the actions taken now by some of the cabinet members, hundreds of thousands of dollars in chartered jets by people who were not supposed to use them, and ask yourself, how many hearings has Congress held on any of this? And the answer is 0. And then you look at Russia. And while we're seeing some commendable acts with Richard Burr and Mark Warner acting in a bipartisan way in the Senate, doing it mostly behind the scenes, you look at the House and at Devin Nunes, for example, and it's hard to say that we have an appropriate kind of check and balance here. And on the kakistocracy, the combination of an administration that is running government like a business, but the business is Trump University, and that has not yet nominated almost 2/3 of the 550 positions that are significant policy-making positions, while in many places purging career civil servants who have been involved in these areas. And you look at a budget proposed by the administration that started out cutting FEMA to pay for the wall, then wanted to cut out the weather satellites so you couldn't be able to tell when hurricanes were coming, and then because the damage would be much greater, you wouldn't be able to do as much to help them after it was over. That may be, off the books now because of what's happened in the last few weeks. An attempt to cut 12 to 15% out of the Centers for Disease Control, which does pandemics, when we have a pandemic through human history almost like clockwork every 100 years. The last one being, hold your breath, 1917. And while Congress is going to change that budget commendably, and I have to say, Tom, actually, the hearing today, which they changed to the Finance Committee, and does have 4 witnesses, so they're doing a little bit better, but one hearing right before we're going to push to a vote. But there aren't the signs of what I would view as real conservatism, which is you want a smaller government, but there are things government has to do, and they should be leaner and meaner and work well. That doesn't seem to be in the picture here, and we find that troubling.
Our chapter on norms, the first draft was written by Norm, and it gave me the idea that we need a radio show, Norm on Norms. It would be sort of like Dr. Ruth. But I just want to say a couple of quick things. One is on norms. we don't realize how important norms are until people stop following them. And there is just certain basic norms that we sort of thought politicians and presidents would abide by. Release your tax returns. People should know if there are conflicts of interest. Cut your ties to your companies because you just might be influenced if a whole lot of people checked into your hotel, for example, or bought memberships to your golf course. There were all these things. Republican and Democratic presidents we accepted that they were going to operate in a certain way, and President Trump has run roughshod over those. We argue in the book that norms have been decaying for a long time, but this is a kind of quantum leap, which I think really, one of my favorite political philosophers, Joni Mitchell, said, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And now we are facing that. On the authoritarian side, look, it's really important to distinguish between alarmism and vigilance. I mean, thank God we live in a country where, and I hope I don't jinx it, somebody isn't going to go barge through that door and pull us down from this platform. We are still a free country. There are still institutions that are protecting our freedom, including the courts. We still have a free press. But vigilance, I think, the president has given us good reason for vigilance, and we have a chapter on his autocratic tendencies. Three things autocrats typically do. One is they attack the courts, and President Trump has done that. Not criticize the courts because you don't like decisions. He's gone way beyond what presidents have done when they don't like court decisions. Second, attack the media. Well, there's certainly a lot of that going on, as Tom said. By the way, it was nice. I think that might have been the first nice thing said about Khrushchev at AEI ever. But the press being the enemy of the people was too much for Khrushchev, for goodness sake. And so we know that is happening. And then the third is demonizing your opposition, rendering the opposition illegitimate. And whether it's Lion Hillary or it's Lion Ted, Crooked Hillary, Little Marco, and on, President Trump and the people supporting him, have gone from saying the opposition is wrong, which everybody has a right to say, to really suggesting that there's an illegitimacy there. And so we think you got to keep an eye on this because it is troubling. And we talk proudly about all our institutions and our checks and balances, but in the end, the institutions are only as strong as the people who occupy key places in them. And you do need courageous judges. You do need, we would argue, far more oversight than President Trump has gotten out from this Congress. The institutions don't work if people aren't vigilant. And I think Trump has made an awfully good case for our need to be vigilant.
I certainly would agree with that, but don't you think that the next Democratic or Republican president can restore those norms?
The late great Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of our heroes here, used the term defining deviancy down. And I'm afraid that's the era we live in. Once norms go, it's hard to bring them back because the standards are set lower. And we're seeing some of that now. There's a deadening to things that we would have been absolutely outraged about in the past. So a part of our task, and I think it's true of all of us in this room, and it's true of the society more generally, is we are going to have to unite around a set of standards and raise those standards. And it's not just about personal behavior or kleptocratic behavior. It's also about something Tom and I have been writing about forever, which is the regular order, which is returning to some of those things that Mitch McConnell promised he would do and didn't. And, there are no angels here. Everybody's violated norms, as Carlin mentioned. But violating them and then moving back to making sure that it's a one-time thing or an occasional thing, and having them defining deviancy down, we're going to have to raise deviancy back up.
We argue in the book that it's much too hopeful to think, when Trump is gone, everything will be fine. We worry about Trump and Trumpism and the extent to which the structure of our politics has changed in a pretty dramatic way. And the real test of our democracy will come in the wake of Trump, of what patterns of behavior occur. And that work has to begin right now. We don't know whether Trump is going to be gone next year or in 3 years or in 7 years. And we don't know how he's going to leave office. And so we worry about short-term damage, the need to contain, but we also have to think about the broader problem.
But I want to say, I fundamentally agree with the premise of your question, Carl. In other words, this is also a hopeful book. And I do think that defeating Trump is important because that is the first step toward restoring some of these norms. And I think there already is a backlash in the country against some of this, which we see as very hopeful. We argued in the Post yesterday that there were a lot of favorable signs. So yes, we can make a comeback from this, but Trump has created a circumstance in which we not only have to do a lot of work to recover from him, but we really have to look back at the long decay and ask what's happened over the last 20 years. We write in the book, Trump is the only politician I know of who can successfully fend off one scandal with another scandal. And that's really remarkable. We can do better than that.
I certainly agree with that. As I look at the polls and look at those people who support Donald Trump, they have no illusions about his demeanor. But I think what they're saying is he's on my side. He's not politically correct. And they're responding to some larger forces in the society. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that that's what I see in the public opinion polls.
Barney Frank once said the definition of your political base are the people who were with you when you're wrong. And so Trump has a base like all it's actually, to Barney's credit, I think it's an old Chicago machine guy who first said that. So there is some of that. And I'm curious, you are so expert in the polls. Here's what I am struck by. I think there's an actual erosion going on in Trump's core support. That Nate Silver had an interesting piece analyzing a whole series of polls where if you just look at the approval number, it's fairly constant in the high 30s. It's hit in some polls recently, gone over 40. Maybe that's the Chuck and Nancy show kicking in a little bit. But he's basically been, the lowest in history, but in the 30s. But what Nate Silver pointed out is that the proportion of people who say they strongly support Trump has been dropping, and it's down to about 20%, the people who strongly support him. I really don't believe that the Trump constituency is blind to what's going on, and you see in a lot of polls recently, people not liking a lot of the things he's done recently. They don't like the way he's divided the country. So I do think that while he's held up to some degree with a very, starting with a very low number, we should say, I think there's an erosion in the hard core that he should worry about.
I would argue that the strong approval numbers are very erratic. We've just looked at every single poll for the last 2.5 months, and they bounce around, I think, more than Nate Silver suggests. I think it's important.
Thank you.
I think it's important. It's important to remember too that at the end of Barack Obama's presidency in the 2014 polls that I just looked up this morning, that he was seen as a divider too, by a solid majority of the public.
One of the things to say about his base, and even looking more widely, we really call out in this book for a new empathy. And there are people, certainly there are people who support him for really ugly reasons, but there are a lot who really have felt that their voices have been taken away. And some of them for very, I think, important reasons that we write about in the third section of the book that is a roadmap forward and a little bit more hopeful. We've had real problems with that decline in community, the opioid crisis that's taken over, the economic inequality, and the sense of stagnation, the belief that so many people have now that there's no future, not just for them, as the powerful quotes that EJ mentioned said, but for their children or their grandchildren. And if we don't start a dialogue, and that dialogue may not work for a solid core of people who just are not going to believe anything else, but for a whole lot of others that begins to understand the reasons for pain out there, then we have a real danger of coming apart.
And we also argue that there is something deeply wrong with holding one group's pain against another's group's pain, and that is a recipe for division and inaction. And so we sort of feel pretty passionately, and we talked about this. One of the fun things about doing this book was we had a lot of conversation over passages, or even before they were written. And we really struggle with this question because, on the one hand, there is this desperate need for empathy in the country, and that includes empathy for a person in Reading or Erie, Pennsylvania, who had a blue-collar job that paid decently and suddenly finds himself, and it usually is a him in this case, earning half or less of what they might have earned 20 years ago. On the other hand, it is also legitimate to have empathy for the African American who started being in that circumstance in inner cities because of deindustrialization 30 years ago. William J. Wilson's great book, When Work Disappears. It's legitimate to ask for empathy for an African American parent who's worried that his young unarmed son is going to get shot. We need empathy all around. And people say this is my Bobby Kennedy fantasy. And maybe it is. You know, Bobby Kennedy famously uniting white working class and African Americans. But I think we need leadership in the country whose goal is to bring us together, not leadership that really seems to thrive on tearing us apart.
Thank you, E.J. I know a lot of you want to hear about this trio's views of the Democratic Party and what some of the problems are there, but I want to give Norm the last word to talk about the last section of the book, which is what we do now, how we go forward as a society. He's called for a new patriotism, a new civil society, and a new democracy. Norm, want to talk a little about that?
We start with a chapter on the new economy, and we call for a charter for American working families, a GI Bill for American workers, and a contract for American social responsibility that would alter corporate governance in some fashion. And while we can't go through all of the ideas, the notion here is to try and deal with some of these larger elements of economic dislocation and move towards a more vibrant economy. And we've found ideas that cut across a lot of the spectrum in many cases, and that could reach a common ground, including some from people here at AEI, as well as many on the left. Then we move to a new patriotism. And one of the things that the discussions of the last couple of days around the NFL have focused on, and we do this in an earlier chapter, there's a distinction between nationalism and patriotism. And nationalism, which has a long and in some cases proud history in the United States, also has an ugly side to it. And we've seen that, of course, in Europe as well as a little bit here. Patriotism, which is much more of a process of uniting people around the idea of being Americans and those strong American values, returning to that, a renewal of that kind of patriotism is important to us. Just as important is creating a new civil society. Edmund Burke referred to our little platoons. And all of the notions of knitting and healing community, some of which, as E.J. has just talked about eloquently, that cut across all of these areas that include people of all stripes in America. And finally, in the new democracy, it is a laundry list or a whole host of ideas, structural changes in our political system to make the voting process work, to make the campaign finance system work. I will tell you, I was a little chilled to see billionaires basically send a message a week or so ago that we have a $360 million war chest to use in the next elections that we will only use if you repeal and replace Obamacare and give us the tax cuts, which is not exactly the kind of cavalier comment made in the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United that, not even the appearance of corruption here. We're talking about extortion in some ways that needs to be, I think, considered at least and dealt with. It may have to be dealt with more by empowering small donors, but we look in that area as well as in some of these areas from the Electoral College to the way the House of Representatives is set up, including looking again at multi-member districts, which can be done without constitutional change, that might move us away from a more polarized system that has districts that are all or homogeneous, where we get echo chambers instead of more broadly representing America.
Say a little bit more about the new patriotism.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah.
in Europe, we usually think of nationalism as blood and soil, right? It's our heritage, it's our land, that's who we are, it defines us. In America, it was never that. What made us Americans was our acceptance of small r Republican institutions and democratic values. It was a set of ideas and an acceptance of processes whereby we live together in spite of our diversity as a nation of immigrants. It's very different, and so we're trying to sort of build on a very different conception to bring meaning again to e pluribus unum, out of many one, and that's where the argument about empathy comes back in. These are scary times. For one reason is because of the racial and cultural divide between the parties now. We don't have the overlaps we once had that eased these differences and allowed us to talk to one another across blue and Republican and Democratic identities. So it's very different, and we have to work as hard as we possibly can. And one way of doing that is trying to put ourselves in other people's shoes and seeing the world as they see it, not accuse them of not voting their own interest, but in fact understanding what they said. Carlin brought this up before. Lots of legitimate resentments, but they reflect a broader set of divides. And, public opinion follows leaders more than leaders following public opinion. And Trump began with a controversial, shocking and controversial election, as narrow as it can get, not by trying to unite everyone, but realizing he succeeded by finding enemies and demonizing, and that's been a part of his 9 months in office. And what we're trying to suggest is something different. It could destroy our democracy and our society. The tribalism is frightening, and so we have to figure out a way to deal with it. And calling out behavior, as we saw in Trump's speech in Alabama, which was a stream of consciousness of a set of biases and hatreds that is very dangerous for our society.
I'm grateful you asked about the new patriotism because I'll tell a story about writing the book, but I think people who are liberal or progressive at times get uneasy with patriotism because they worry that it glides too easily into chauvinism or a very dangerous kind of nationalism. It sounds like we're better than you. And yet loving the country you're from or the place you're from can be a virtue, just like loving your family is. And when you love your family, it doesn't mean you don't love other people, and it doesn't even mean you think your family is always better than other people. In fact, you probably know better than anyone that might not always be the case. And the other thing is we have to face the fact that democracies really has run effectively only within nation states. And we haven't really built very successfully. The EU has tried, but with mixed results, to create democratic structures outside the nation state. And that when people repair, the most brilliant, if manipulative slogan used in recent years was the slogan in Brexit, take back control. And it was this sense that people have lost control. But the story I want to tell, I just want to read one paragraph from the book on the new patriotism, if I could, because we had written this long chapter on the new patriotism. And I sent Tom and Norm an email, and I said, we got all this analysis here. we don't explain why we love our country. So I wrote this passage, which I worried might be a little too gooey. Maybe Adam still thinks it's a little too gooey, I don't know. But fortunately, Tom and Norm are equally gooey. And so I just want to read that one paragraph, if I could.
We're family.
Yeah, right, exactly. The last acknowledgement in the book is to each other, because it's a miracle that after doing this, we're actually better friends now than we were before. It really could have gone the other way, but we should take pride in the United States' exceptional ability to absorb newcomers and also in their own intense desire to be American. American culture is made up of many cultures, regional as well as ethnic, but there is a national culture that all of us share in and shape. Our culture freely absorbs new ways of thinking, talking, making music, playing sports, cracking jokes, that was for Norm, and telling stories. But generation after generation, we create and recreate a uniquely American synthesis. The old and the new interact and coexist. To borrow from Walt Whitman, our great national poet, we contain multitudes. We honor our democratic tradition and appeal across our divisions to a set of founding documents that we revere even as we argue with them. We are raucous, mobile, rebellious, and contentious, reverent but also irreverent, individualistic but also communal. We can be resolutely local in our loyalties but also capaciously national. We're strivers who also come to each other's aid. We love our country not only for its ideals, but also for its tensions and contradictions. And that's a brand of patriotism that we think we are proud to uphold, and we think a lot of different kinds of Americans could uphold.
I want to talk about the Democrats, but first one observation about the books, and these are my very good friends.
So you can take her criticisms really seriously.
That's right. You talk a lot about empathy and about calling out bad behavior. I stopped counting the phrase radical right, radicalized, demonizing, incendiary, extreme. Is that the way you start a dialogue with the other side? I mean, there were those words on every page, almost.
Let's go back to the family. You need to have an honest conversation. You need to say where you stand and where things went wrong. We are very careful in the book, as I think you'd agree, to talk about those many conservatives, particularly in the intellectual world, less in politics, who have been willing for conservative reasons to call out the abuses that they see at this moment and their fears over what Donald Trump has, the dangers that he poses. We talk in our whole chapter about civil society goes out of its way, I think, to say that this conversation about the breakdown of family, the breakdown of community, is a conversation that ought to take place, should take place across the lines of ideology. I'm actually the guy who wrote Robert Nisbet into the book because I made a point of quoting him because, I've always admired him, but his notion of where community collapses, places where community collapses are places that are subject to the lures of totalitarianism, what he wrote back in the 1960s. So yes, we are openly disappointed by the radicalization of the Republican Party. We are openly troubled by what this has done for our country. And on those issues, we are going to have fights until somebody wins this argument. But I think that in a lot of ways, at a lot of points in this book, we kind of have at least I'll speak for myself, and I'm sure this is true of Tom and Norm, sort of respect for the underlying conservative project that we think so many forms of contemporary conservatism have betrayed.
But you have to admit that people like Robert Nisbet and the people that we really revere, the Marty Lipsitz, the Everett Ladds, would never use language like this.
Well, in today's politics, I believe they would. They'd be shocked by what has happened to the Republican Party. I mean, Norman and I, when we first came to Washington, we built and earned a reputation of not being partisan guys. We called it like we saw it. We had dear friends on the Republican side of the aisle. We work with them, and then we watch what happened. And it's an unnerving story, and it's told sometimes most vividly by former Republican elected officials who've left that body and don't recognize the party that remains. We've seen a party have no inclination or interest, and I'm talking about elected in government, not conservative intellectuals, for facts, evidence, science. Any interest in compromise, really rejecting the inheritance of a policy regime that goes back to Teddy Roosevelt, and following processes within Congress and in politics that are very different from anything that my dear friend Marty Lipset ever observed and wrote about. So yeah, I retain conservative friends, but most of them are not part of this change that's occurred. We see Edmund Burke as a champion and as a real conservative as opposed to radicals.
But aren't you rendering the opposition illegitimate, just what you accused Trump of doing? And I think about the 40 years of Democratic rule in the House of Representatives. I think many Republicans would say that they felt abused by Democrats, and if you look at the behavior of someone like Speaker Wright, the kinds of violations that we saw were just a precursor in many ways to some of the things that we've seen today.
We've written about that.
So let me weigh in. First, when Tom and I did the book, The Broken Branch, in 2006, we dedicated it to Barbara Conable. And Barbara remains my ideal as a representative. I spoke at his memorial service and said to his family, you might just think of him as a member of Congress, but he was just a whole lot more than that. That's a different Republican Party than exists today. Now, it's absolutely the case that 40 years of consecutive rule by Democrats in the House led to all of the things that the framers talked about. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts even more. And what we saw was an arrogance. We saw a condescension towards Republicans. We saw some abuses of power, using proxies, for example, in a way that they shouldn't have, shutting out very good and constructive amendments at times. No doubt, there are no angels here. But this is a different phenomenon. Now, having said that, this is a delicate balance. You want to call out bad behavior, and that includes not just elected officials. There are neo-Nazis out there. There are genuine racists out there. There are people who want to use violence out there. And separating them out and condemning them for what they do without condemning everybody is a difficult thing to do. Calling out bad behavior by members of Congress, if you don't do it, then they'll do it even more, and they'll do it in an even worse fashion. And we've taken a lot of reporters to task for not doing that enough. And, you know, it's something we struggle with a lot, including the use of the language. But as Tom said, we've had lots of very conservative former Republican members of Congress talk to us and say that they're at sea with what to do about a party that isn't focused on solving the problems anymore. And some of that is leaders within the Congress. As Tom said, leadership matters, and when leadership goes in a bad direction, you have to call it out. And we will not shrink from calling out Democrats who do the same thing. But at this point, and you know, there's a danger, of course, that we see both parties move in a direction that simply leaves out the center. But having said that, there is an imbalance here. And what we see is that right now, we've got especially a party that's in power, not just in Washington, but in so many states. And what you see in state legislatures is something that makes even looking at Republicans in Congress look more moderate by comparison. The generation moving up, conditioned and educated by a tribal media and social media where truth just doesn't seem to matter much anymore. If we don't start to move this back in a different direction, and I think maybe with slightly different language, although Jennifer Rubin sometimes pushes the envelope with us in terms of language for all the reasons that we're talking about. But whether it's a Max Boot or an Evan McMullen or others, we're seeing a lot of people who see the same danger that we do.
And in fact, we quote, people, I don't think anybody has been more critical of the current state of American conservatism than either Pete Wehner or Mike Gerson, for example, who are card-carrying conservatives. I am reminded of an interview that a Tea Party person gave a reporter where she said, "Oh, they call us extremists, but they said that about the John Birch Society too." And I bring that up for a reason besides the fact that I thought you might enjoy that, is that I really do think that certain ideas that were ruled out of bounds on the legitimate right by people like Bill Buckley, who was by no means a moderate, have actually entered into the conservative mainstream and have been accepted. I don't think that birtherism would have been permitted into the mainstream of conservatism all those years ago. I think there are conspiracy theories that have been allowed into the mainstream conversation that were not let in by an earlier generation of conservatism. So I really do think that it is appropriate to call out extremism. It doesn't mean you don't take conservative ideas seriously. It doesn't mean you don't want to have fruitful conversation with conservatives. I grew up in a conservative family. I had a dear Republican uncle of mine, and we spent 35 years arguing politics, and I think argument is a good thing. And when he died, his kids were very kind and said, "We want you to give the eulogy." And I made a point of quoting Richard Nixon in the eulogy, and I looked at the church and at the casket, and I said, I like that particular Nixon quote, but the real reason I quoted Nixon is because I was hoping that Uncle Ray would come back to life and point to me and say, "I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday." When we're in a country where our president is far more extreme and far more troubling than Richard Nixon, I think we have more to worry about.
One quick question before we go to your question. Democrats right now are pretty clear on what they're against and what disgusts them. What are Democrats for?
Who wants to go first? This could be a long talk.
No.
Well, we've got to turn to your questions.
There is one of the reasons we wrote the book is because if you look at the economic agenda that we have in the book, it draws across the board, including, is Michael Strain here? Good AEI's Michael Strain. Where are you?
He's not here.
He's not here. Well, Michael is somebody who's a conservative I admire, but I always say, as a Catholic, he's been so affected by Catholic social thought that he can never really get all the way over to some of AEI's positions. But we have sort of a set of agendas from Elizabeth Warren and from Kirsten Gillibrand and from Sherrod Brown that are all about helping people in the gig economy, a whole series of things on family and medical leave. There are a lot of ideas out there on how to use community colleges as basis for training. You could easily, the national service is a central theme we have here. There is infrastructure, obviously, is a big part of the story. I think the Democrats stand for a whole series of things, and Hillary Clinton stood for a whole series of things. If you actually had enacted the entire Hillary program, I believe it would have lifted up a lot of the people who were left out. The problem is that, and we make a stab at this by trying to codify our proposals into 3 different baskets. The problem is that progressives haven't figured out yet how to say what we are about is dealing with a degree of economic change that is leaving a lot of people out of prosperity, and that our task as a country is to create shared prosperity. There are about 15 things, there are probably 20, 25 things that we talk about that would contribute to that. There are a lot of Democrats who are for those things. There are some other things we get from actually joint Brookings AI efforts on, particularly on poverty. So I think there are plenty of ideas out there. But right now, the focus is on opposing Trump. And that's the other point we make is in opposition to Trump is actually a series of affirmations. It's an affirmation that you should take government seriously. It's an affirmation that policy making matters. It's an affirmation that you should respect the courts and a free press. The opposition is affirmation, just as when Ronald Reagan ran, he was anti-communist, he was anti-tax, and he was anti-government. Well, what that was, as every AEI scholar would tell me, it was an affirmative agenda to roll back totalitarianism, to ensure what conservatives would see as economic freedom, and to lower the tax burden on people. And so I think out of opposition, it's what I like to call the power of negative thinking, that positive ideas come out of opposition, and I think you're going to see more of that.
But would you agree that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are talking a very different language from Bill Clinton? And that the party has been pulled very substantially to the left?
By the way, when Bill Clinton was in office, Republicans said he was to the left, and his program, his health care program, which, by the way, was more progressive than Barack Obama's. Barney Frank, my old congressman, likes to say that Republicans love both dead Democrats and Democrats who are out of power because they always cite them. There is certainly, Bill Clinton did not identify himself as a democratic socialist. I will certainly give you that, but go ahead, Don.
No, I would just say there's always going to be a struggle inside the parties between a more ideological base and the more pragmatic wing. And it's a center-left on the Democratic side. It's a center-right that I think on the Republican side has become a right-right, and that's the mainstream. It's very conservative against what I would see now as a more radical element. The sort of moderates are no longer a part of it. But there's a real danger on the Democratic Party that you get a Newtonian reaction that breeds a counter-reaction. And there's a struggle going on now. I don't see this as resulting at this point in the triumph of some really angry, noisy, radical left. And even if you look at most of the people who have endorsed a single-payer system and ask them, it is an aspirational goal. It's not, this is the only thing we stand for. It is sometime much further down the road. Right now, you just want to stabilize the insurance markets and improve the system as it operates. We have not yet seen the kind of destructive primaries that, and I hope we don't ever, that go after people who are more moderate, more centrist, who represent their states. You're not going to be long in a state like North Dakota or Indiana or Montana right now if you take on a different kind of agenda that would itself kind of pull a party apart and create an even greater opening for a more demagogic opportunity. And what we want to do is to make sure that we don't see both parties take the same course. And I think if you look at the positions taken by Democrats who have been chairs of committees in Congress, who are now the ranking members, for the most part, you're not going to see some radical left agenda.
Tom, the last word on the Democrats, and then we're going to your questions.
Democrats believe in government. Okay? They like lawmaking and legislating. They think policy analysts and wonks are worth listening to. And they actually believe, as AEI scholars do and Brookings scholars do, that policy ought to be empirically based, and we have joint efforts and projects like that. But that's not what you get on the right from elected officials and people active in politics and the social media. The other big difference, I'd say, is there's always a sort of wacky left and a wacky right, but what's happened is the wacky left is out of elective office for the most part. And they're pretty pragmatic. Nancy Pelosi gets demonized as an ideologue. She's the most practical, effective leader we've had in Congress in the last decades. And that's all to the good. It's because Democrats are looking for a deal. They want to find something they can do, even if it's incremental. Those calling for utopian changes, dramatic changes, are doing so rhetorically, but oftentimes out of out of the real mainstream that's affecting policy. I think there has been a modest shift to the left, but it's certainly well within the American mainstream.
And it's a response to some radical economic change. We're talking about inequality to a degree that we weren't before, and even people on the right are starting to have to grapple with inequality. So in a way, reality has moved left in the sense that the problems that the left talked about are more central to the economic agenda today than they used to be.
And now it's time for your questions. We'll start over there, and if you could identify yourself and ask a question, please. Mike is coming, yes, sorry.
Thank you, guys. John Ward, I'm a journalist with Yahoo News. You guys in the past have, or one of you, I think Tom mentioned, the party decides. And a number of you, maybe all three of you, have disagreed vehemently with people like Jonathan Rauch, who wrote a piece for The Atlantic about a year ago saying we needed to bring back machine politics. The title of that was How American Politics Went Insane. I haven't heard a ton from you guys on this topic since the election, and I'm wondering if you've reassessed any of your disagreement over the case that we do need to bring back machine politics. In particular, Elaine Kamarck wrote in the spring in favor of a process that would be a pre-primary process to vet the nominees. Thanks.
Can I, for anybody who is interested in this argument, Tom and I wrote a long paper about, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, taking issue with Jonathan. By the way, somebody I really admire, really smart, really creative mind. This was a sort of an argument between friends who had a real disagreement on something. And our skepticism about machine politics is I don't see any social basis for how you rebuild machines that look anything like the machines that existed before. B, there's an awful lot of romanticism about the political machine. The political machine, at its worst, was deeply corrupt. It didn't deliver for people. It didn't deliver good public services. We tend to focus on certain kinds of machines that had some success in at least, paving the roads and picking up garbage. And by the way, Barack Obama, a long time before he became, a national figure, borrowed some ideas out of Chicago, and he argued that the problem with the new machine is that we now have pinstripe patronage, and that at least the old machine might have delivered some jobs in the neighborhood. The new machine is based on fundraising, where you deliver consulting contracts and legal contracts to, consulting contracts to consulting companies, legal business to law firms, and so it's the machine without the jobs, which is about the worst combination I can think of. But secondly, we don't locate the source of the problem in the same way Jonathan does. He seems to think that if you just gave, and I'm parroting him a little bit, and so forgive me, Jonathan, if I am, but there's an argument here that if only you gave more control over campaign money to the central agents of the political parties, they would ensure that we got better candidates. We have plenty of centralized control, and if you really want to fix things, we think you need old-fashioned reforms to limit the power of political money, not to just pump more money into the system through political parties. And Tom, I don't want to leave it just to myself, because Tom has very strong views on this too.
No, EJ summarized it really fine. The reality is, which Jonathan would never accept, is that party leaders in Congress control most of the so-called outside money in politics.
Up here, the mic's coming.
Hi, my name is Cláudia Trevisan. I'm from the Brazilian newspaper Estado de São Paulo. Going back to the speech on Friday in Alabama, I'd like to know how much success Trump, and talking about patriotism, how much success Trump may have in instigate this more narrow view of patriotism that he's talking about, how much divisive it can be, and how concerned are we with
Which
that?
one of you want to take that?
So I think there may be a hopeful side to this. Among other things, this is the first time I felt positively towards the NFL. It is the first non-negative thing I've said about Roger Goodell, whose father, Charlie, I knew when he was in the Senate and was just a terrific man, and the apple fell very far from the tree. But that's come back, but it's created a different conversation.
He's not even a Patriots fan like I am.
That's
you know?
right. It's created a different conversation. And I think what we saw yesterday with the reaction of the NFL teams, and by the way, many of these athletes, including some like LeBron James, who never went to college, that are just amazingly thoughtful and articulate and powerful in what they say, that tried to create a different definition of patriotism that's very much like our definition of the new patriotism. The patriotism is when you can dissent. And when you're kneeling, you're not spitting on the flag. You are dissenting from some elements of things that have happened in the society that trouble you. And the idea that you are a multimillionaire black athlete, and I've talked to a few who are scared to death every time their sons or daughters go out and drive in a car at what might happen to them. That's part of what we hope will bring a new level of empathy, and that NFL players who are addressing an audience that includes a whole share of this Trump base might get them thinking again about this. But the larger point here is a president who continually focuses on that 25 or 35% to try and shore them up however he can do so in a fashion that is aimed at separating them out from the rest of the country. And that is not the behavior we have seen from other presidents. That includes, I think, all the presidents going back over a long period of time.
Okay,
Just
we
very
have a question
quickly, we have cycles in the country of a patriotism defined as a narrow kind of jingoism, and other times when we have a more expansive view of it. There are a lot of people who are anti-communist without being McCarthyite. There are a lot of people who are patriots without being jingoists, without being this aggressive kind of nationalist. And I think we're going through one of those periods now. We should romanticize the past and think we were always perfect on this score as a country. We weren't. We've gone through phases, and I think the other side of this argument is fighting back. And Sunday was a good example of that.
Okay, a question here and then one here. And then we'll go back to you.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kravitz. Thank you for the panel. More importantly, thank you for writing this book.
Thank you for buying this book.
Now I have to buy the
Always remember, it makes a great holiday gift.
Yes.
See, I like that Norm, as the AEI guy, can be the purest capitalist on our panel. So thank you for that, Norm.
And now I lost my train of thought. No. I grew up in Latin America, and where you were either on the right or on the left, and if you were somewhere near the center, you were pegged as a death squad member, or you were pegged as a extreme communist. And I grew up admiring the United States, where it didn't matter if you were Republican or Democrat, you could disagree and yet legislate and move forward. And eventually immigrated and proudly became an American, and never imagined that the U.S. today would look so Latin American in the negative sense. But my question is to pick up on Carlin's, one of her questions about talking to the other side. I read about a poll that said that half of the Trump voters actually believe that he won the popular vote. I mean, it's not a question of like believing in God. That's like like the facts, right? I mean, so how do you talk to somebody that actually believes that Trump won the popular vote and move forward?
Okay.
Thank you.
And let's put this question on the table too, and then one of you can answer each of them. Okay. Yes, and identify yourself.
Thank you very much. My question relates to the external manipulation of voting and voters. And particularly, I'm from Wisconsin, and Hillary Clinton lost Wisconsin by 24,000 votes. It was verified. 125,000 people voted for third-party candidates. If you asked in late October, there were a lot of Republicans who, pre-Comey, would have not voted for Trump. If the WikiLeaks dump hadn't occurred, there were certainly Sanders people who might have voted for Hillary Clinton in a state like Wisconsin. So I haven't heard you all discuss the effects of these kinds of external manipulation on voter participation, because polls won't show that.
Who wants to?
You want to? I'm afraid much of the public's perception of facts are defined with the partisan lenses they read. Their reading on how well the economy is doing depends on whether their party is represented in the White House, and it changes almost immediately. You get 70, 80 percentage point shifts on how well it's doing if your guy is in the White House now. So what it tells us is that most Americans aren't thinking deeply about politics. They're busy people. They've got families and jobs and communities, and they rely on identities, strong identities, to groups, including political parties, and then use that as a shortcut for interpreting what's going on. And it's always been that way, or certainly it's to some extent it's been that way, and it's worse now because they're seeing the same behavior from their leaders. The elites are making such arguments and questioning facts. So it's complicated the problem enormously. The way to deal with it is to try to have, as best as you can, a non-challenging but serious conversation and say, okay, you put your evidence on. Cass Sunstein has urged that we reinstate a public square in the internet world, but also try to design communication mechanisms that get us out of our echo chambers, because so much of our thinking is motivated reasoning. We believe what we believe because that's what we're supposed to believe as Democrats or Republicans.
Yeah. If I could just add a point here, the great Dan Yankelovich, who passed away this weekend, always made the point that Americans don't start with facts. They always start with values, and that's the way you have to have these discussions. And I think Tom is right. We're busy people. We're not going to go home and read a tome about climate change. We're going to think in broad, general ways about these issues, and we always start with values, and that's one of the big cleavages that we have. And now to this question, any thoughts about?
Could I just say, we haven't answered this. Can I just say something on your question?
Yeah.
Those 25% are probably not persuadable. There is the 25% who believe that are probably not persuadable people. They are part of the base. And there's always been, on any question, you can find political knowledge lacking on both sides of politics. I am reminded of the great story when Paul Tully, the great Democratic activist, died. Ron Brown, the chair of the Democratic National Committee, Paul Tully was a Democrat, worked for Bill Clinton, and he died in the middle of the campaign in '92. And Ron Brown sort of said, this is hard. It was at the National Cathedral. And he, I'm sorry? Are you responding to my question? Yeah.
That was her question. No, she was talking about the
Russian voter turnout.
Oh.
No, this is different.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll forget. I'll tell you the Ron Brown story when we're signing the book. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about the... I think...
Be quick, because we have to get a few more questions.
Oh, just real quickly. There were some real problems in Wisconsin because of the new voter ID laws, and I think one of the things we have to look at in analyzing the Wisconsin vote is how much of the Milwaukee vote was low because of a response to Clinton, and how much of it was a response to the voter suppression. And I think that you're right, that some of the late events in the campaign, whether it's the WikiLeaks or the Comey move at the end, almost certainly had exactly the effect you are suggesting. And the best evidence we have of that is what Trump ran the last week of his campaign on. He shifted his entire campaign advertising, with some exceptions, to the Comey statement, exaggerating what Comey had actually said. I think it's hard to doubt. There's a lot of good evidence that had the shift you intended, pushing either some people to Trump and some people to third party.
But we also know that those late deciders in those states in particular broke decisively for Trump. That doesn't usually happen. Now to your question. Yes, you.
Thank you.
And you get the last question.
Oh, thank you. I'm Henry Palmer. I'm a retired attorney, a Democrat. You spoke, Carlin, about, you asked, what, hasn't this happened before? That is, when Democrats were in, Republicans were out, they seized and abused power, and vice versa. And I think that's right. That is, you have had that before, and one of the saving graces has been that we have free elections, or pretty free elections, and ultimately it changes. And then the other part, what I see, and what I get your reaction in, is maybe it's not changing. You've talked about we're headed toward 30%, 70% of the people living in 15 states that are metropolitan areas, and 30% living in the rural states or in the non-metropolitan states, and having a huge amount of power over the electorate and over the elections. What if your optimism, your empathy program is not working? What if it doesn't work? Where do we go when 70% of the people are being governed by 30% of the people? I got to believe that's an unacceptable long-term situation. Do we end up with states seceding from this country? Something that nobody I've ever heard talk about before? Can we look to the Republic of California? Do we look to a confederacy of states? Remember states' rights? They sound good again. What do you think about all that? Have you thought about that in your book at all? Or is that a different book?
It's the next book.
So somebody asked me during the campaign, what are the 3 places you would go if it all falls apart? And I said 1, Australia, 2, New Zealand, and 3, the first manned colony on Mars. And then the response was, well, the first person to sign up for Mars was Newt Gingrich. And so I need a plan B. There is a danger here that we chip away at the fundamental legitimacy of the system. And a part of that danger is more power is going not just to smaller states, but the states that are homogeneous, and they tend to be much more white. And as the demographics shift in the society, that changes the relative power in a whole series of ways that are a real challenge to a pluralistic society. Now, some structural change is required, and the biggest problem may not be the Electoral College. As EJ said, this movement to try and get 270 electoral votes in states that pledge that they will have their electors vote for the winner of the popular vote is a way to do it without a constitutional change. The Senate is a much bigger challenge. If, right now we have 51% of the population represented by 10 senators, and it's moving, in this terrible direction, or 10 states, 20 senators. So you move in that direction, and it's a very tough challenge. What we have to do first is move towards a different kind of civil society where the jolts that we have seen represented now, Trump has given us. These larger secular trends in the society combined with the immediate threats get us thinking again about what kind of society we have, and maybe if we can also change some of the other elements of the political system, political money and so on, we will end up with a new generation of lawmakers who begin to look at this in a broader way and not just in the narrowest sense. But if we don't change that, that's quite a ringtone.
Yeah.
Or maybe
it's Mars calling.
I don't know. It's
it may be a cri de coeur of some sort.
Yes. Newt may be there already.
If we don't have a larger consciousness about the dangers that we face here, then you end up with a society where large numbers of people representing even a supermajority have less and less of a say in what's going on. And we are hopeful, but we're realistic as well. And that's why, the last chapter that we have, we title, Show Up, dive in, stay at it. That's a good way to end, perhaps.
I want to
Could I-
thank you all for coming, and I want to thank our panelists. I think it is quite wonderful that a conservative Republican and 3 liberal Democrats can have a very civil conversation, and now you have an opportunity to buy the book. Thank you so much.
And tell us all who you are, because sometimes we don't even know who we are.